There are certain truths that society, in its moral comfort, prefers to keep buried. One of these resides in the figure of the one who departs from the nest, the one who breaks the blood bond. Common sense labels them as cold, ungrateful, or at best, selfish rebels who succumb to modernity. But if we could observe this phenomenon through the lens of analytical psychology, we would see something entirely distinct and profoundly more tragic. The individual who detaches from their family lineage is not necessarily a broken being, but rather the one who, perchance, was the only one to awaken within a slumbering household. In my clinical work, I have repeatedly witnessed that the act of moving away from the family of origin is not a sign of emotional weakness, but paradoxically, the highest manifestation of sanity that the psyche can engender in the face of systemic pathology. To comprehend this dynamic, we must descend into the depths, where blood meets the soul, in what I have termed the familial unconscious. A family does not merely share a genetic load, it shares a cohesive psychic field, a reservoir of unspoken truths, denied traumas, and repressed emotions that all members silently agree to ignore. It is a dense collective shadow, which becomes the true foundation of the house. In this domestic theater, abuse is rebranded as rigorous discipline. Emotional neglect is disguised as training for independence. The chronic narcissism of a parent is justified as a strong and demanding personality. And any member who dares to name these dissimulations aloud, who dares to point toward the darkness that everyone swore did not exist, automatically becomes the problem. Think of this as an unwritten contract, signed not with ink, but with the subtle anxiety that fills the air of the living room. Every family establishes inviolable rules about what can be recognized and what must remain hermetically concealed. These rules are not discussed. They are transmitted through looks of disapproval, the abrupt change of subject, and that specific, almost palpable tension which arises when someone touches upon the forbidden topic. The familial unconscious operates therefore as a kind of shared delusion, and the maintenance of this delusion requires the exhaustive participation of all its members. It is in this scenario of orchestrated denial that the figure of the truth-bearer, the notorious black sheep, emerges. The individual who eventually cuts ties is almost always the one who perceived the dissonance from the beginning. They witnessed the cycles of rage of the alcoholic father. They felt the emotional manipulation disguised as unconditional love. They recognized the archetypal game of the golden child and the scapegoat, dynamics that the rest of the family insisted on normalizing. But the position of this individual is dangerous, and the burden immense. They did not merely notice the patterns, they absorbed them, desperately attempting to mend that which in its essence was structurally broken. Such people possess what may be called differentiated perception. They are those who can read the emotional atmosphere of an environment. They sense the abyss between what people say and what they in fact mean. They carry the weight of the non-verbalized resentments that float in the familial ether. This is not a superpower as some might romanticize. It is a survival mechanism refined in an environment where the incorrect reading of the room could signify emotional or even physical risk. When external reality is chaotic, the psyche hypertrophies in the capacity to predict dangers. The result is that the family, incapable of confronting its own shadow, projects the entire pathology onto the most sensitive member, transforming them into the identified patient. The family points the finger and declares, "You are the problem. You are too sensitive. You cause the drama. You need therapy." The tragic irony, and one frequently ignored, is that they are correct about the need for therapy, but they are fundamentally wrong about the diagnosis. The individual who distances themselves is not sick. They are having a healthy response to a sick environment. They are not the infection. They are the fever that signals the presence of the infection. They are the symptom that cries out for cure, not the cause of the disease. Nevertheless, the family will hardly ever accept this truth. To admit that the one who left acted rationally would mean admitting that something is profoundly wrong with the family system itself. Confronting the familial shadow would require a pain and a restructuring that most systems are psychologically incapacitated to withstand. Instead, they reinforce the narrative. They tell stories about the ungrateful child who squandered everything. They unite through a shared victim narrative, further solidifying the unwritten contract, and the individual who escaped, the exile, observes from a safe distance, finally able to breathe pure air. I comprehended this dynamic through the lens of individuation. The journey to become your authentic self is impossible while you remain imprisoned in a role designated by the unconscious needs of others. If your family designated you the archetype of the scapegoat, you will spend your life absorbing the guilt of others. If they made you the fixer, the repairer, you will exhaust yourself trying to heal wounds you did not create. If they needed you to be the golden child, the ideal, you will suffocate under the pressure of their projected fantasies, never being able to commit a human error. Individuation demands separation, not necessarily physical distance, although it is often a vital prerequisite, but an irreducible psychological distance, the capacity to know exactly where you end and where their need begins. It is the capacity to discern which thoughts are yours and which are voices implanted since childhood, whispered by the fears and desires of your parents. It is crucial to distinguish between the guilt that signals a genuine moral error and the guilt that is merely the symptom that you are breaking an ancient familial script. The moment you recognize these archetypal roles for what they truly are, the perspective shifts. You begin to perceive that your family does not know you. They know the character who was functional for them in maintaining the stability of the familial unconscious. And once this clarity is established, the individual is confronted with an impossible choice. Continue acting in a play for which you never auditioned, maintaining the system's peace at the cost of your own soul, or step off the stage and initiate the terrible and glorious journey to discover who you really are. This leads us to the breaking point. I have observed that the cutting of ties is rarely an impulsive act. It is not a grand emotional explosion, but rather a slow death by 1,000 small cuts, culminating in a moment of perfect clarity. A family member asks, for the 100th time, that you ignore your reality and accept their fantasy. A parent demands that you apologize for having established a healthy boundary. A sibling expects you to pretend that the abuse never occurred. And suddenly you simply know that nothing will change. Hope, this slow poison, finally drains away. This clarity differs from rage or hurt. It is quieter, colder, more certain. It is not an emotional decision. It is a fundamental recognition. You are not making, continues, a profound psychological foundation. We are speaking here of an existential choice concerning the very survival of the soul's integrity. This is the critical juncture where the singular individual psyche, the emerging self, enters into direct confrontation with the overwhelming inertia of the family's collective unconscious. It is a moment of radical refusal, the refusal to be immolated or sacrificed upon the altar of superficial harmony and fabricated domestic peace. This imperative is driven by the internal pressure of the transcendent function, which actively compels the individual consciousness to embrace the excruciating anguish of psychic cleavage and separation in order to achieve eventual wholeness and individuation. The subject engaged in this painful process is not electing the path of mundane contentment or immediate happiness. Rather, they are choosing the path of uncompromised psychological veracity, the truth. And the truth, as all students of depth psychology are acutely aware, manifests itself almost universally as a numinous, awe-inspiring, yet profoundly isolating and terrifying experience, demanding absolute fidelity to the inner life. To fully grasp the magnitude and the excruciating depth of this perennial psychological dilemma, we must first undertake a rigorous analytical examination of the familial persona. A truly healthy familial system is characterized by its capacity to engage in conscious, ongoing negotiation and integration with its inherent collective shadows, acknowledging their existence, and the one who departs is not the one who is broken. He is the one who is gathering himself. He is becoming agonizingly his own destiny. If you do not sever the ties, your soul becomes the battleground for a conflict that is not your own. The ancestral burden, which I term the family complexes, continues its operation. The collective unconscious does not merely manifest in dreams and myths. It asserts itself through the power dynamics and the persistent neuroses of a lineage. To remain is to willingly accept being the receptacle for the shadow that the entire family system refuses to acknowledge. And what is the nature of this familial shadow? It is the cumulative sum of all unprocessed emotions, the repressed resentments, the moral failures, and the painful truths that have been swept beneath the psychic carpet. The family system, in its desperate quest for superficial stability, the collective persona, requires a repository for this darkness. The individual who possesses a differentiated perception, the one who acutely senses the dissonance, is automatically elected to bear this profound weight. Jung observed, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The individual who separates is paradoxically fulfilling this mystical task. By withdrawing, he compels the shadow to emerge into the light, not necessarily for the family, who usually denies it with greater vehemence, but critically, for himself. He can finally examine what has been projected onto him and distinguish what authentically belongs to his essence and what has been imposed by the inherited system. This act of psychic differentiation is the prerequisite for all subsequent growth and the integration of consciousness. Consider the archetype of the hero. The hero's journey, at its core, is always a pilgrimage of radical separation. The hero must abandon the familiar and secure world, the psychic womb of the family, to confront the dragon, the shadow, and return with the treasure, the integrated self. The modern scapegoat is the hero who fundamentally refuses to perish for the clan's collective neurosis. His perceived coldness or distance is not a deficit of love, but the necessary forging of a boundary, essential for the survival and integrity of his soul. The profound cost of failing to separate is the immediate interruption and potential stultification of your individuation. Individuation is the arduous, lifelong process of becoming a singular, complete being, the integration of the totality of the psyche, encompassing both the conscious and the vast unconscious domains. This monumental endeavor demands that the individual emancipate himself from primary familial identifications. If you remain psychically entangled, you continue to exist not as the nascent self, but as the rigid persona that the family structure demands for its own homeostasis. Imagine the persona as a meticulously tailored social garment. If the family has imposed upon you the elaborate attire of the savior or the burdensome cloak of the eternally incompetent, you will spend your entire existence attempting to inhabit that prescribed role. The fundamental problem is that the persona is merely a social function, a bridge to the outside world, not your intrinsic essence. When the persona becomes pathologically rigid, and there is absolutely no space for the expression of authentic internal life, it suffocates the inner vitality. The person then risks becoming what Jung termed pneumatic, inflated with external expectations and social significance, yet fundamentally empty and devitalized within. Separation is the violent, yet utterly necessary act of tearing away this constricting mask. The acute pain that accompanies this psychic severing is not merely the grief of lost connection, but the profound shock of beholding one's true face for the very first time, stripped bare and utterly unprotected. This confrontation with authenticity is the crucible where the self begins to solidify. The family drama extends far beyond merely projecting the shadow. It fundamentally distorts the deeper structures of the psyche, particularly the animus, the masculine principle in the woman, and the anima, the feminine principle in the man. These internal archetypes are essential for relating to the external world and for forming one's inner spiritual and logical landscape. If, for example, the familial environment was overwhelmingly dominated by a controlling, emotionally punitive, or absent paternal figure, the daughter's internal animus might develop in an excessively critical, dogmatic, and destructive manner, mirroring the internalized model of authority that was violently imposed upon her formative psyche. Similarly, if the maternal figure was suffocating, manipulative, or emotionally volatile, the son's anima might become exceptionally weak, leading to an inability to connect with his own feelings, or conversely, it might become extremely reactive and defensive against any form of feminine presence or emotional depth in relationships. When the individual consciously withdraws, he is not solely cutting external bonds. He is simultaneously initiating a massive internal restructuring of his fundamental psychic imagery. He must strategically disinvest the psychic energy that was previously trapped in the perpetual, exhausting struggle against the real parents, and redirect that energy into the challenging construction of a healthy, autonomous animus, or anima. This is perhaps the most arduous labor of post-separation individuation, the critical recognition that the relentless internal critical voices and the unrealistic, often destructive expectations placed upon intimate relationships are, in fact, merely the internalized, unexamined projections of the parental figures. This process requires a conscious confrontation with the internal tyranny inherited from the lineage. The overwhelming guilt that haunts the separating individual is, therefore, not a genuine sign that he has committed a moral transgression, but a powerful, compelling echo of the familiar unconscious, attempting fiercely to maintain its psychic hegemony. It is the insidious voice of the complexes asserting their autonomous power, whispering, "You are not permitted the luxury of being an independent individual. Your sole purpose is to serve the needs of the system, even unto your own psychic death." This guilt is the system's last, desperate defense mechanism against the advent of consciousness. It is profoundly fascinating to observe how the decisive moment of separation is frequently marked by an occurrence of synchronicity. It is rarely just a cold, rational calculation. It is an event that feels unmistakably orchestrated by destiny itself, a seemingly unrelated series of minor events, a chance encounter, a sudden professional shift, a phrase read in a book, all align, dramatically culminating in that aforementioned moment of cold clarity. Synchronicity, for Jung, is the meaningful coincidence of two or more events which lack a discernible causal relationship, yet possess an identical or strikingly similar meaning. In the context of familial separation, the precise moment of the cut often coincides with a profound, undeniable internal calling or an unavoidable external existential crisis. It is as though the self, the immense totality of the psyche, is transmitting an unequivocal, non-negotiable signal. The time for separation is now, or you risk psychic stagnation and eventual spiritual dissolution. The individual does not choose to withdraw solely out of anger or resentment. He is instead summoned, compelled by his destiny. He feels the strong, inexorable hand of fate, the self, forcefully pushing him out of the confining familial garden, irrespective of the crushing emotional pain and social censure that this expulsion inevitably entails. By choosing to separate, the individual accepts full, unequivocal responsibility for the trajectory of his own life. He is compelled to become his own father and his own mother, a profound act of psychic self-generation. This internalization is the absolute core of true adult growth and maturity. What does it truly mean to become your own father and your own mother, specifically in Jungian terminology? It signifies the essential development of the capacity to provide oneself with the necessary structure, discipline, and firm boundary setting, the paternal principle, logos, that was lacking in the original environment, while simultaneously extending unconditional acceptance, emotional nurturing, and deep compassion, the maternal principle, eros. Many individuals who remain trapped within pathologically unhealthy family dynamics never manage to develop this crucial interior parenthood because they are perpetually, and often unconsciously, seeking from their real parents, or from romantic substitutes, the validation and fulfillment they never received. Separation radically forces the individual to internalize and actively embody these necessary archetypes. The path forward is undeniably solitary, because it stringently demands that you become the sole point of origin for your own moral authority and your own emotional affection. You must consciously forgive yourself for the mistakes you made while you were merely the symptom or the carrier of the family's unresolved issues. And you must also forgive the parents for being simply human, flawed individuals trapped within their own, often intractable, unresolved complexes. Physical separation may constitute the necessary first step, but the true enduring work is the psychological and spiritual separation. It is the deliberate decolonization of the mind from the internalized, toxic voices that constantly assert you are too much, or tragically too little. Jung meticulously taught us that life is the ongoing, dynamic struggle between what we were determined to be and what we possess the potential to become. The family is the fertile ground of our origin, the genesis of our story, but it must not be permitted to become the impenetrable cage of our ultimate destiny. The individual who courageously separates is not destroying essential bonds. He is, in the most profound sense, salvaging his soul so that perhaps one distant day, he might be able to return to the world as a whole, integrated being, and not merely as a fragmented projection of an inherited trauma. The one whom society hastily labels as ungrateful, selfish, or rebellious is, in reality, the only one who has genuinely heeded the urgent, life-saving call of the self. He is the singular individual who dared to utter the categorical no to the suffocating collective unconscious of his lineage, in order that he might finally say a resounding yes to his own authentic life. He is becoming, in the most rigorous and profound sense of analytical psychology, a complete individual. And this process of individuation stands as the highest form of spiritual and psychological sanity to which we can possibly aspire. Word count, 1251 words. An ontological decision. This is the critical juncture where the soul, weary from its persistent contortions and agonizing efforts to compress its vast essence into a confining form that is fundamentally not its own, finally achieves a vertical integrity. It decisively rights itself and, in doing so, shatters the restrictive mold that had long held it captive. This profound clarity is not synonymous with the cessation of suffering. Rather, it is the terrifying and necessary recognition that the enduring, corrosive pain of remaining stagnant is infinitely greater than the acute, vital pain of separation and decisive severance. This realization constitutes the ultimate and most unforgiving lesson of synchronicity. The individual consciousness, having achieved a state of truth, aligns itself inexorably with the primal, archetypal necessity for self-preservation and the ultimate survival mandate of the total personality, the self. The individual who consciously chooses to withdraw and establish existential distance is not merely abandoning a set of specific people. They are fundamentally rejecting and severing ties with the collective shadow that defines their lineage and ancestral history. This rejection encompasses the unspoken, unrecognized darkness and the accumulated psychological debris passed down through generations. This is precisely why the subsequent reaction from the family unit, the repository of this inherited darkness, is so profoundly violent, visceral, and emotionally immediate. To truly understand this dynamic, one must imagine the family as a cohesive, biological organism, a system that has, over time, developed a malignant tumor within its core system of operational beliefs and values. Every other healthy member of this systemic unit has gradually adapted, sometimes over decades, to the insidious presence of this psychological malignancy. They have meticulously rewritten the fundamental rules of life and ethical interaction solely to accommodate its presence and ensure its continued function. Chronic alcoholism, for example, is not defined as a problem requiring urgent intervention. It is benignly reframed as the simple way father chooses to relax and unwind after a stressful day. Controlling behavior is not categorized as abuse or manipulation. It is justified as protective love or necessary guidance. Denial, therefore, is not merely a symptom. It becomes the essential structural adhesive that maintains the integrity of the entire fragile edifice. The individual who makes the radical decision to depart is, in this metaphorical sense, attempting a psychological extirpation, a surgical removal of the tumor that the system depends upon for its false stability. The familial organism, sensing this existential threat to its homeostasis and its carefully constructed reality, mobilizes all its psychological defenses with immediate and overwhelming force. The family's collective unconscious, operating like a vigilant, jealous guardian protecting sacred but toxic traditions, springs into immediate action. Its primary and most potent defensive mechanism deployed against the departing member is massive projection. The family unit is psychologically incapable of tolerating the devastating idea that it might be inherently sick or dysfunctional, as such a realization would necessitate an agonizing and painful restructuring of their individual personas, the masks they wear to function in the world, and the collective social facade they present to the community. Consequently, they are compelled by psychological necessity to project the entirety of the perceived sickness, the moral failure, the profound ingratitude, and the perceived insanity onto the singular figure who dares to question the established, destructive order. The departing individual instantaneously becomes the living repository, the designated container for all the accumulated failures, unrecognized sins, and unacknowledged neuroses that the family system adamantly refuses to confront or integrate within itself. Jung observed that the intense suffering experienced by the isolated individual is frequently, perhaps even archetypally, the concentrated suffering of the entire collective unit. The designated scapegoat is forced to carry the crushing burden of guilt and failure that rightfully belongs to all. By walking away, this individual dramatically ruptures the implicit and often multi-generational pact of silence and denial. In enacting this rupture, they force the familial shadow to manifest, not through genuine repentance, introspection, or self-pity, but through aggressive moral indignation, punitive judgment, and sanctimonious outrage against the perceived rebel. The tragic paradox inherent in this process is inescapable. The individual who is desperately striving for psychological sanity, integrity, and self-possession is immediately labeled, ostracized, and pathologized as the insane, unstable element. Yet, as I have often insisted in my work, the greatest and most important task incumbent upon the human being is the monumental effort required to become an individual, and this task is so inherently difficult, so fraught with internal resistance and external conflict, that the vast majority of people, consciously or unconsciously, prefer the comfortable, familiar madness of conformity instead. Conformity offers the deceptive comfort of familiarity, a psychological warmth derived from established patterns, even when that familiarity is demonstrably destructive, spiritually debilitating, and actively eroding the soul's foundation. The steep, inescapable price of true psychological individuation is the acceptance of radical, profound solitude, a necessary isolation from the collective neurosis that allows the inner work to flourish, free from the contamination of external expectations and judgmental voices. When the individual finally achieves physical separation and successfully withdraws from the orbit of the toxic system, the real, rigorous psychological labor only commences at that very moment. The physical departure is merely a necessary prerequisite, a successful severing of the umbilical cord, but the subsequent psychological and emotional separation is the true arduous forge where the authentic soul is hammered into shape. For years, perhaps stretching back to early childhood, the cognitive landscape of the individual's mind has been systematically colonized by the internalized, often critical voices of the family unit. These voices dictated the answers to the most fundamental questions of existence. What actions are truly acceptable? What achievements are genuinely desirable? What is the quantifiable measure of my inherent worth? These existential inquiries were consistently answered through the distorted, self-serving lens of the parent's own unresolved psychological needs, complexes, and unfulfilled aspirations. The newly separated individual must now engage in the painstaking, meticulous work of identifying, isolating, and ultimately dismantling the deeply entrenched parental complex that has been internalized as an internal operating system. This demanding process requires the ability to sharply distinguish between genuine, ethical guilt, the kind that naturally arises from an actual moral error or violation against one's own core values, and the insidious, neurotic guilt, the pervasive feeling of dread that only arises because one has dared to break a restrictive, predetermined role or violate an expectation imposed by the family system for its own comfort and stability. If the individual was systematically taught that their inherent value resides exclusively in their utility or usefulness to others, the internal critical monologue, the internalized parent voice, will relentlessly scream the accusation of selfish with every single necessary act of self-care, boundary setting, or legitimate rest. Similarly, if one was conditioned to believe that the expression of anger or frustration is fundamentally dangerous or morally corrupt, they will self-punish and engage in profound self-sabotage for experiencing even legitimate, necessary frustration in the face of injustice or boundary violation. This stage marks the crucial time to confront, integrate, and heal the personal shadow, that denied, disowned aspect of the self, which was actively cultivated and amplified by the dysfunctional family system. The system inherently trains the individual to deny vital, powerful parts of themselves, their ambition, their capacity for righteous anger, their fundamental need for rest, and their assertive ability to articulate the boundary "no," all in service of maintaining a false, superficial peace. The voice that was previously externalized and used only to criticize or judge the family must now be compassionately redirected inward, employed not for judgment, but for the profound psychological healing of the puella aeternus, the eternal child complex, the deeply wounded, vulnerable essence that still resides within the adult structure, demanding recognition and care. The very act of separation and departure is, psychologically speaking, a modern and necessary reenactment of the fundamental hero myth archetype. It represents the arduous crossing of the spiritual and psychological threshold, where the nascent hero is compelled to face the formidable dragon that jealously guards the promised treasure. The specific dragon in this contemporary narrative is not a beast of fire, but the primordial fear of psychological annihilation, the terror of utter abandonment, and the crushing anxiety of not being fundamentally loved or accepted by the original tribe. The ultimate treasure hidden beneath layers of fear and complex is the authentic, unified self. The ensuing exile, whether it is a deliberate self-imposed withdrawal or a forced ostracization by the system, carries an immense, profound archetypal weight. The exiled individual embodies the figure who truly does not belong to the common collective, one who exists precariously between two worlds, the past world of conformity and the future world of potential. They often assume the role of the wanderer, a solitary figure perpetually walking the earth in relentless search of a profound meaning and a destiny that was never bestowed upon them, but must be forged internally. Society, often trapped within the rigid confines of the collective unconscious, and its superficial morality, fails utterly to grasp the sacred nature of this internal journey. It sees only the destructive breaking of tradition, the heinous betrayal of blood, and unforgivable ingratitude. Yet the exiled individual is engaged in a work of far greater cosmic magnitude, the essential search for and creation of their own unique personal myth. The life unlived, I often warned, is a virulent disease from which we can ultimately perish, leaving behind only the husk of potential. The individual who breaks away is making the conscious ethical choice to live their own singular life, rather than serving as the mere vessel for the unfulfilled projected script of their parents. They are deliberately exchanging the illusory, suffocating safety of the familial cage for the terrifying, boundless, and essential vastness of true psychological freedom. And what profound truth does this individual ultimately encounter in that terrifying vastness? They encounter the manifestation of synchronicity. When one is psychologically imprisoned within the confines of the toxic family system, life is experienced primarily as a disheartening series of neurotic repetitions, a continuous loop where the same destructive patterns, conflicts, and emotional traps manifest themselves predictably across all subsequent relationships and life domains. This is destiny constrained and imprisoned by the complex. However, when the individual successfully achieves liberation from the complex's grip, they begin to experience life as a meaningful sequence of profound, causal encounters, where the outer world, in uncanny ways, begins to reflect the radical internal transformation that is underway. They begin to attract novel relationships, opportunities, and connections that actively support their unfolding individuation process, rather than those relationships that seek to stifle, suffocate, or drag them back into the familiar pattern of stagnation. Synchronicity flourishes and becomes a palpable force when the individual is thoroughly aligned with their deepest inner destiny and the imperative of the self. The universe itself appears to conspire in their favor, not through some form of simplistic, cheap magic or wishful thinking, but precisely because the immense psychic energy that was previously trapped, bound, and consumed in the perpetual exhausting struggle against the family's gravitational pull is now liberated and channeled entirely into the vital act of conscious creation and self-actualization. The act of detachment, therefore, must not be perceived as an act of destruction, abandonment, or purely negative severance. It is, fundamentally, an act of radical, profound creation. The individual is actively creating themselves anew, ex nihilo, utilizing only the raw, pliable clay of their own hard-won experience and the illuminating, unwavering light of their own refined consciousness. It is absolutely vital to comprehend that this painful separation process must not, under any circumstances, culminate in perpetual hatred or lingering bitterness. Hatred is merely another form of emotional chain, a psychological anchor that still binds the individual inexorably to the very past they sought to escape. True, sustainable freedom is achieved only through the rigorous, necessary processes of mourning, grieving, and the eventual cultivation of genuine, mature compassion. One must first deeply mourn the tragic loss of the ideal family they desperately needed to have, the functional unit that, in reality, never truly existed in the objective world. One must also grieve for the lost, vulnerable child they once were, the spirit that was forced to accelerate into premature adulthood and self-reliance far too early merely to ensure survival within the dysfunctional environment. And finally, the mature adult must cultivate compassion, not the kind of superficial compassion that compels a return to the cycle of abuse or forces a denial of past wrongs, but the profound, sober compassion that fully recognizes the deep, flawed humanity of their parents and their ancestors. They were not monolithic monsters of malice. They were complex, suffering human beings trapped and constricted within the cage of their own unresolved complexes, neuroses, and unconscious psychological wounds. They were victims, in turn, of their own parents and of a pernicious collective shadow that relentlessly extends its toxic influence across multiple generations. They gave the individual what they possessed the capacity to give, even if what they could offer was only the singular, painful wound that ultimately provided the necessary impetus, the profound motivation, to seek out the unifying core of the self. No physical separation is paradoxically the genesis of genuine confrontation. Many individuals, upon severing biological ties, experience an immediate, almost intoxicating sense of relief, a profound draft of fresh, untainted air. They mistakenly conclude that the familial shadow has been successfully left behind, interred within the vacant architecture of the house from which they fled, with such desperate haste and psychological urgency. Yet, I assert that the family is not merely a geographical entity. It is a pervasive spectral presence, lodging itself deep within the fundamental scaffolding of the individual psyche, an indelible imprint upon the soul's terrain. This initial, exhilarating flight is merely a preliminary maneuver, not the decisive battle for selfhood. The true work lies in excavating the inherited psychic material. Familial neurosis should not be misdiagnosed as an external contagion. It is, rather, a highly charged, complex, an autonomous cluster of psychic material that has traveled seamlessly with you across all boundaries, meticulously nested within the constructed layers of your public persona, and fiercely active in all your subsequent projections onto the outer world. The individual who successfully escapes the designated role of the family scapegoat, for instance, does not automatically achieve liberation from the entrenched victim mentality. Instead, they commence the unconscious, almost instantaneous process of projecting the oppressive parental imago onto their spouse, their professional supervisor, or most tragically and ironically, onto the nascent personalities of their own children. This transference mechanism ensures the cycle continues, albeit disguised under new social contracts and professional hierarchies, proving that the internal pattern dictates external reality. The sanctity of marriage, the demands of the workplace, and the intimacy of friendships are transformed into the new, unsuspecting stage upon which the family drama, the very production you swore you had permanently resigned from, is relentlessly and agonizingly reenacted. You find yourself irresistibly drawn into relationships with partners who demand the precise, exhausting role of the caregiver that your mother once required, or you encounter figures of authority who chillingly replicate the cold, relentless, and often unjustified criticism previously dispensed by your father. The cosmos itself, operating through the mysterious, meaningful principle of synchronicity, appears to conspire with the internal landscape, forcing an unavoidable confrontation with the very psychic material you so desperately sought to deny and evade through physical distance. This pattern of repetition is the universe's most urgent psychological summons, indicating that the unconscious demands integration. It is precisely at this juncture of distressing and predictable repetition that the accumulated psychological tension reaches its inevitable, shattering climax. The individual is forced to perceive, often with a shocking, visceral clarity, that the essential defining battle was never truly waged against their family unit existing externally, but against the profoundly entrenched internalized family structure operating within the self. The The desperate external flight, the severance of all visible connections, has utterly failed in its primary objective, the purification and subsequent reconfiguration of the internal psychological landscape. The burden remains because the battlefield was always contained within the boundaries of the skull, demanding internal restructuring rather than external evasion. I have observed repeatedly in my clinical practice that the attainment of genuine psychological sanity necessitates a radical and often painful psychological death, a necessary ego sacrifice, and a complete dissolution of the old, obsolete identity. You are mandated to confront, analyze, and systematically dismantle what I termed the neurotic structure that has been meticulously internalized over decades. Consider the implications. The family provided you with a rigid script and an accompanying costume, the specific persona you adopted for sheer survival, whether it was the tireless peacemaker, the obligated brilliant achiever, or the strategically invisible observer, was fundamentally nothing more than a carefully constructed mask. This apparatus was primarily designed to manage their collective anxiety and expectations, not to express or nurture your unique, emerging individuality or essential nature. The definitive moment of truth arrives when you find the internal fortitude to absolutely refuse to don that familiar mask ever again, choosing authenticity over comfort and embracing the anxiety that comes with self-definition. This interior confrontation is infinitely more violent, more demanding, and more consequential than any heated external argument could ever be. It necessitates a profound and unflinching commitment. You must willingly seat yourself at the very epicenter of your own shadow, within the dense reservoir where all the hatred, the righteous rage, and the accumulated, unacknowledged pain, all the forbidden emotions you repress to maintain the semblance of familial peace, reside. You must consciously grant a legitimate, unrestrained voice to the silenced child, to the perpetually misunderstood adolescent. You must permit the full, overwhelming force of the fury, the very emotion that was previously dismissed and labeled as mere drama or excessive sensitivity, to be completely felt and processed, without the convenient, destructive mechanism of projection onto an external target. This processing is the necessary alchemy of the soul. It is precisely within this crucible of inner turmoil that the self begins its slow, undeniable manifestation. The self, that central unifying archetype of psychological totality and wholeness, acts as the definitive compass, perpetually pointing toward your essential, irreducible truth. But for the self to successfully assume the governance of the personality, it must first execute a necessary coup d'etat. It must unequivocally dethrone the tyrannical authority that has dictated your existence since birth, the formidable, internalized parental complex which holds the ego captive and inhibits genuine autonomy. The parental complex is not merely a collection of sentimental memories concerning your mother and father. It is a deeply ingrained, emotionally charged constellation of beliefs, rigid rules, and potent emotional mandates that dictate, often with absolute certainty, what constitutes good behavior or bad behavior for your specific existence. Your parents, frequently through unspoken actions and atmospheric signals rather than explicit instruction, taught you that to be deemed good often necessitated profound submissiveness, or that to be considered loved required you to be relentlessly useful or compliant. When you attempt the courageous act of charting a new, autonomous path, this complex screams its disapproval, with the unmistakable echoing voice of your mother or father, utilizing the most potent and historically effective weapon in the family arsenal, crippling guilt. This guilt acts as the psychic tether, attempting to drag the nascent self back into the familiar orbit of obligation and inherited patterns. The pervasive guilt that inevitably surges when you begin the essential work of establishing a healthy, non-negotiable personal boundary is not, contrary to the complex's insistence, a definitive sign that you have erred morally. It is rather the screaming alarm signaling that you are actively shattering the deeply rooted, unconscious contract of conformity established long ago. The individuating individual must laboriously learn to distinguish between genuine moral guilt, the type that arises organically from an act of betrayal or error committed against the integrity of the self, and the insidious, crippling neurotic guilt, which is ruthlessly imposed by the familial persona, purely to coerce immediate conformity, and maintain the established, dysfunctional equilibrium. This distinction is paramount to true liberation and the formation of an ethical center aligned with the self. The absolute climax of your lifelong journey toward individuation is crystallized in a definitive, internal declaration, a revolutionary statement of being. I am definitively not the pre-assigned role that was thrust upon me. I am, fundamentally and irrevocably, my own sovereign authority, the sole governor of my psychic domain. This is the moment the ego aligns itself with the will of the self, asserting its right to self-determination against the weight of ancestral expectation. This revolutionary declaration constitutes, in its most profound essence, an act of psychological parricide. One is not engaged in the literal destruction of biological parents, but rather in the necessary, painful obliteration of their internalized imago, the psychological construct that resides within the heart, operating as a cold, demanding internal tyrant. This symbolic death is invariably felt as a profound, comprehensive grieving process, for in this act, you finally, irrevocably lose the illusory, deeply cherished hope that they might, one day in the future, miraculously transform into the perfect, nurturing parents you so desperately required in childhood. The mourning is not for the people, but for the potential that never materialized, allowing the ego to finally face reality. Once this tyrannical imago is systematically dismantled and rendered inert, the individual experiences a terrifying psychological vertigo, a sense of existential disorientation and profound instability. The immediate questions are destabilizing. Who am I if I am no longer the designated scapegoat? Who defines my existence if I am no longer the exhausted savior? This liberation, though sought after for years, is often profoundly terrifying, precisely because the identity constructed upon the foundation of dysfunction, despite its inherent pain and limitation, was undeniably familiar, predictable, and thus, in a perverse way, psychologically safe. The void of the unknown self is harder to face than the known oppression of the complex. As I have often stated, the encounter with oneself is the encounter with one's shadow, and this truth is never more starkly evident than in the aftermath of familial disengagement and the subsequent internal reckoning. The familial shadow that you have carried, often unknowingly, served as the concentrated reservoir for all the vital dynamic qualities that the family system explicitly denied or vigorously suppressed. The necessary, righteous rage, the focused, sometimes selfish ambition required for success, the essential, uncompromising need for autonomy and self-will. Now, the arduous task is to integrate this shadow, not in order to become morally cruel or socially destructive, but specifically to become psychologically whole and complete. You must consciously embrace your own human imperfection, your inherent darkness, so that these denied aspects cease their destructive operation, governing your life and decisions from the hidden depths of the unconscious, manifesting as inexplicable behaviors or self-sabotage. The integration of the shadow is the pivotal, transformative act that converts mere psychological flight into an unshakable, internal foundation. You cease to exist as a reactive victim, perpetually responding to the echoes of past traumas, and instead evolve into a conscious creator, acting decisively from an established, immutable internal center of strength and ethical clarity. This transformation marks the successful transfer of authority from the externalized complex back to the self, making the individual the author of their own life story. The individual who has willingly passed through this purifying psychological fire emerges not as a bitter, reactive rebel, defined solely by opposition, but as a truly sovereign being, defined by self-possession and inner peace. They grasp, with profound clarity, that the ultimate purpose of their singular life is not the exhausting, impossible task of curing the persistent neuroses of their parents or their lineage, but rather the focused realization of their own unique, destined fate. This person becomes the crucial point of inflection within the family line, the singular ancestor who, for the very first time, consciously prioritized psychological health and authentic self-expression over the crippling obligations of blind, inherited loyalty and conformity to dysfunction. And it is exclusively within this state of hard-won psychological sovereignty that true, mature compassion finally becomes a viable possibility, a compassion that fundamentally does not demand the self-annihilation of self-sacrifice, but one that is capable of recognizing and acknowledging universal human pain without becoming emotionally infected or psychically entangled by it. It is the moment of definitive understanding that for some souls, the act of leaving the physical home is not an act of betrayal or moral failure, but is, in fact, the only viable method left to honor the precious, singular life that was bestowed upon them. Separation is, therefore, not the end, but the profound prelude to the deepest, most necessary form of connection imaginable, the enduring, unbreakable connection with the entirety of the integrated self. Continued exploration. Separation, therefore, constitutes the essential prelude to the deepest form of genuine connection, the profound connection with one's own self. This initial psychological severance is not merely a breaking of ties, but a necessary surgical incision that allows the nascent individual psyche to establish its own independent orbit, moving away from the gravitational pull of the familial complex, which often stifles authentic development and maturity. Yet, the arduous path following this inevitable rupture is emphatically not paved with pleasantries or comforting reassurances. Psychological sovereignty, once attained, invariably brings with it the inherent burden of absolute freedom and the existential weight of self-authorship. The individual who successfully extricates himself from the intricate, often suffocating familial web soon discovers a crucial and frequently painful truth. The vast majority of his previous identity was merely a meticulously constructed persona, a social mask carefully tailored to meet and satisfy the projected expectations and collective demands of others. The monumental psychological work that must now commence is the difficult process of systematically stripping away this elaborate mask and facing the raw, terrifying nudity of the emergent self. The self, si mesmo, in Jungian terms, stands as the central governing archetype of psychological order and ultimate totality, representing the complete whole of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious elements. It is the transcendent point that encompasses and mediates between the realm of consciousness and the vast, unknown territory of the unconscious, acting as the internal guiding beacon that perpetually yearns for complete psychic realization and fulfillment. To successfully approach and integrate the self, the individual must exhibit tremendous resilience, resisting the pervasive, regressive temptation to immediately fill the existential vacuum left by the separation from the family structure with new, equally debilitating dependencies or harmful emotional projections onto external figures or ideologies. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health, I frequently observed in my clinical practice. This maxim underscores the fundamental principle that psychological growth is intrinsically tied to confrontation with suffering. The challenges encountered during separation are not obstacles to be avoided, but rather the essential friction required to temper and solidify the authentic personality, transforming mere potential into concrete, realized existence and establishing resilience. The profound solitude that invariably follows this necessary rupture must not be perceived as an empty void to be desperately feared, but rather it must be embraced as the sacred, consecrated space where the soul is finally granted permission to breathe freely and deeply. This is the opportune moment to shed the inherited persona, the one that was externally imposed upon the individual, and begin the arduous task of forging a new, resilient social representation that is genuinely faithful to one's unique inner essence. What conventional society often dismissively labels as mere egoism is, within this transformative psychological context, revealed to be the most profound and necessary act of ethical responsibility, the unwavering responsibility owed specifically to one's own unique, unrealized potential, and the imperative to live one's own life fully, without compromise to the collective neurosis. The individual who has bravely undertaken this complex journey of separation and subsequent integration is no longer relegated to the historical role of the family scapegoat or the designated black sheep. Instead, they emerge as the conscious carrier of a radically new psychological awareness. This person effectively becomes the psychological ancestor who, for the very first time within the lineage, possesses the strength to decisively break the cyclical pattern of neurotic repetition that frequently plagues the entire bloodline. Crucially, this individual has not cured the entire family, a task deemed impossible from an external vantage point, but has achieved the far more significant goal of curing himself. This personal healing inevitably resonates deeply within the structure of the collective unconscious. His individual therapeutic achievement thus transforms into an archetypal model, establishing a tangible possibility for psychological freedom for all those who are destined to follow his self-directed path. The ultimate culminating purpose of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a whole, indivisible being, is not the attainment of illusory perfection, but rather the comprehensive achievement of totality. This requires the courageous acceptance that the human psyche is inherently composed of both illuminating light and its necessary counterpart, the shadow. The individual who dares to pursue wholeness, who consciously integrates their historically denied, repressed parts, simultaneously ceases the destructive habit of projecting their inner darkness onto others, and even more crucially, stops passively absorbing the psychological darkness emanating from external sources. This integration is the bedrock of psychological maturity and self-mastery. When the psyche achieves this fundamental internal alignment and holistic balance, the external world begins, quite remarkably, to respond with a corresponding sense of order and meaningful structure. It is precisely at this juncture that the profound concept of synchronicity, the meaningful, a causal coincidence, comes powerfully into play. External events cease to appear as merely random chaotic occurrences, and instead begin to reflect, with stunning precision, the state of the individual's profound internal growth. The universe itself appears to conspire in favor of the person who has dared to courageously tread the difficult path of the self, primarily because exterior reality is, in the final analysis, an undeniable reflection of deep psychic reality and inner coherence. Therefore, for those individuals who currently find themselves standing uncertainly at the precipice or the liminal threshold of this seemingly impossible decision, or for those who have already made the profoundly painful, isolating choice to walk their path alone, the message emanating from analytical psychology offers deep and necessary validation. This intense struggle is fundamentally not an indication of a moral or character failure, but rather it represents an inescapable, urgent summons from the soul itself. You are not, in the deepest sense, fleeing or escaping the limitations of your family system. Instead, you are running decisively toward the realization of your unique, predetermined destiny. The acute pain experienced during separation is the inevitable, non-negotiable price one must willingly pay for the priceless achievement of psychological authenticity. The suffering you have endured throughout this struggle was not ultimately in vain. It served as the powerful, necessary catalyst that forcefully compelled you to locate and establish the immutable center of gravity residing securely within your own being, independent of external supports. Always remember my foundational maxim: he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakes. The external world is the realm of illusion and projection. The internal world is the domain of truth and substantial being. The process of psychological awakening is inherently and perpetually solitary, yet it remains the single, unyielding door through which one must pass to access a life that is truly and authentically lived. Your primary psychological work is not the futile effort of attempting to convince your family of your newfound health or sanity. Your critical work lies solely in living your deepest truth, dedicating yourself entirely to becoming the specific, differentiated individual that nature, in its wisdom, originally intended you to be. A unique constellation of psychic forces separated from the mass mind. This, then, is the ultimate and concluding invitation extended by the psyche. Look profoundly within. Courageously face the disowned aspects of your shadow. Systematically integrate the entirety of your personal history, embracing both triumph and trauma. The opus work of your life is not a mere repeating family drama, but rather a singular heroic journey directed purposefully toward the achievement of ultimate totality and psychic completion. The path of individuation is undeniably the most challenging and demanding route a human being can undertake, requiring sustained conscious effort and moral fortitude. However, it is simultaneously the only path that will ultimately lead you to your true, unassailable dwelling place, the unwavering, eternal sanctuary of your very own self. Begin this monumental journey today. The world, fractured and yearning for meaning, desperately requires the realized totality of your unique being.